The basic attack is used as a tool to get your first level up and unlock your first skill point, and then it remains as a backup attack for when you run out of mana for a while, before soon fading out of relevancy forever, never to return to your skill slots again. But what if you stuck with this for the entire game and built your character around this most basic of attacks, KB Diablo 2 with only the basic attack? I picked the Warlock for this run, the fancy new character released in the highly unexpected 2026 Reign of the Warlock DLC for Diablo 2. I removed the skill granted by my starting weapon from my right click, and while I slay the first few of many monsters to come, let's get specific about the rules for this run. I am only allowed to attack using the normal attack. I am not allowed to actively cast spells. In fact, I'm not allowed to ever put a skill on my left or right click, and have to use only the basic attack in both slots for the entire playthrough. I will allow myself to put skill points into my skill tree though, including getting some passive skills to boost up the power of the basic attack. And while mercenaries aren't directly banned, they all use skills, so unless I can force them to never use any of their skills, which I can't, they are not allowed to join me on this quest. And the goal is to beat all 3 difficulties of the game, from level 1 to Bale in Hell. The only passive skill that the Warlock has that was useful to me was Levitation Mastery. Luckily, it is available at level 1, and it increases the Warlock's damage, attack rating, gives him a chance to crit, and reduces the stat requirements for weapons. This skill is just like the Barbarian weapon masteries, but better in every way, and it was the perfect skill for beefing up my basic attack. With no damage boosting skills to rely on, I would have to keep a watchful eye out for any weapon upgrades at all times, like this spiked club with some fire damage. I will try to explicitly mention the most impactful weapon upgrades during this run, but honestly I swapped weapons so often, especially in the first part of the game, that I kind of lost track of it all. I took my time to complete some optional areas and side quests which I usually skip, in order to find even more loot and keep gaining experience, because even though I did not benefit that greatly from skill points, being a high level would be extremely important for this character throughout the entire challenge. I'll talk more about that later, but basically it comes down to the difference in the level between the character and the monster that is fighting having a huge impact on melee combat. After defeating Bloodraven, I got a mercenary as a quest reward. A mercenary companion would have been extremely helpful for this challenge, but as she was an avid skill user, I had to sacrifice her to rock an issue at the magical stones to keep the sanctity of the challenge intact. The main reason that I picked the Warlock, other than him being a shiny new class in a 25-year-old game, was that his unique class trait is that he can levitate a two-handed weapon in one hand while also using a shield, like this two-handed sword. Early on, shields aren't that useful, but I had found this Warlock book for the shield slot. They say that knowledge is power, 3 to 8 fire damage worth of power to be specific. Are you interested in learning a valuable and marketable skill? This video is sponsored by Boot.dev, a fun and interactive way to learn backend development from scratch, earn experience, complete quests, and collect achievements as you hone your skills in languages like Python, SQL, and Go. You can start the full developer curriculum from scratch or pick and choose from a long list of courses depending on your interests. And the key selling point to me is that they've made the site and the course material fun. I find that it is simply easier to engage with learning when the lessons have you write functions for storing information about fantasy RPG characters instead of storing generic values in a variable. And the key to long-term learning is to not get bored and quit. All content is free to read and watch, and with a paid membership you get access to interactive features like game mechanics, progress tracking, hands-on coding, and AI assistance that can help nudge you in the right direction if you get stuck. If that sounds interesting, head to boot.dev to check it out. You can get 25% off your first entire year of the annual plan with my code SARFEN. Thanks to boot.dev for sponsoring this video, and now back to the challenge. With a book in one hand and telekinetically swinging my sword with the other, I bested the Countess and her crew in melee combat. You might not like it, but this is what peak warrior performance looks like. The runes dropped by the Countess would be very useful for this character later on, so as I was looking to gain a bit more experience before I headed to Andariel anyway, I stuck around and farmed the Forgotten Tower and the Countess for a while, collecting Rals, Tals, and an assortment of lesser runes. With both my experience bar and my rune stash fueled up, I moved on towards Andariel, still taking my time to fight through the monastery rather than speeding past it. I reached the Catacombs level 4 at character level 17. I had Levitation Mastery at level 18 now, giving my attacks a significant and much needed boost. The basic attack will never be as good as any attacking skill, so having some form of damage and attack rating multiplier was absolutely crucial. I was still rocking the two-handed sword, I had started to greedily assemble some magic find on my gear, and I had added another book to my library, still some fire damage, and also +1 to levitation mastery. The rest of my gear was random trash cobbled together, with their main purpose being having the gear slots filled. Andariel can be a bit of a pain for weaker characters without good early game skills, or no skills. But being level 17 with a surprisingly healthy looking life pool, I was able to take her down without too much trouble, but also without too much in the way of loot. I had been using the same sword for a while now, so I started the second act by quenching my insatiable thirst for weapon upgrades and bought a magic claymore from Farah. It was fine, literally, slower than my old sword but with significantly higher damage numbers to make up for it. To stimulate Loot Golane's economy, I also purchased a pair of gloves with 21 magic find and 21 lightning resist, as well as a pair of speedy boots and an armor with a chance to cast Frost Nova when hit, for a nice, unreliable bit of crowd control on occasion. The new sword proved to be pretty good as I took most enemies down in just 1 to 2 hits, which made the speed of progress tolerable. But despite good damage, in some fights in Act 2, like against Radamant and his perpetual raising of the undead, my lack of any sort of AoE or reliable crowd control was becoming a glaring issue, and the worst part was that it was likely going to stay that way. Though I will say that for once I did not mind the maggot lair too much, the single file line structure of battles caused by the narrow terrain somehow felt like a blessing for this character. I quested on, collecting the necessary quest items in ancient tombs under the desert. It wasn't bad, but I was already starting to deviate from my plan. My complete lack of splash damage made diligent area clearing against the hordes of undead enemies extremely tedious. Add to that the allure of getting to Act 3 to unlock new weapon types from vendors, and I found myself rushing through the second act. Rushing is a relative term in this context. Despite having started Act 2 at a very respectable level of 17, I had only gained 2 additional levels in the desert, entering Tal Rasha's tomb at level 19 and change. My chance to hit dropped below 80% against some enemies, and that was not good at all. I decided to push on and try to defeat the Act boss, and then recoup some of that experience in the next act, though that was easy to plan for, but harder to execute. Duriel in normal is the slayer of underprepared characters, with hard-hitting attacks, a slowing aura, and a small arena to fight in. Duriel pummeled me with his claws, and with a slow attack speed and poor sustain, I was not able to do much to him before I had to retreat. I managed to disengage and ran in circles, trying to create some space for my potions to heal me back up. But in our next confrontation, I was locked into my animation while slowed down, and I couldn't run away in time, which resulted in my first death of the run. I managed to make it back to the tomb in my underwear, and was successful in my rescue mission to retrieve my body. I really did not want to accept my defeat and grind for more experience in Act 2, so in a desperate attempt to cheese my way through by any means necessary, I bought a flail with 2 open sockets from Farah and put 2 of my hard-earned hell runes into it for a big chunk of poison damage, although delivered over 5 long seconds. I also bought and consumed a dozen of thawing potions for a temporary boost to cold resistance before I headed back. Poison damage being dealt over several seconds is usually a big downside since you can't stack poison on the same enemy in Diablo 2, but for this exact fight it was perfect, as I could use that downtime to run away from Duriel and heal up. This wasn't fast, it wasn't heroic, but it was working, and after a few minutes and many laps around the tiny chamber, I successfully wore Duriel down. He dropped a lot of items, including a pair of green set gloves. Cleglove's pincers has 25% slow and knockback, some pretty unusual and interesting stats, so those went into the stash in case I would want something like that later. The surprising amount of rare items that Duriel dropped was all trash though. Once in downtown Kurast, I could buy Chris daggers from Ormus, and I've been looking forward to getting access to these, not to use them, but to craft with them. This is my favorite cube recipe in the game, because it really feels like crafting, but not in the runic fantasy RPG sense, but like arts and craft crafting. You take a long stick, like a staff, then add a small blade to the top, using a belt to secure the dagger to the base. Then you add a diamond to add some magic, I guess, and this creates a savage polearm weapon with a guaranteed damage roll, which is pretty high for this point in the game. The first one had a bit too high requirements for my taste, so I crafted a couple more and got a savage polearm with good damage that I could use right away. Early on in Act 3 I hit level 20, which meant that levitation mastery was now completely maxed out. Good and bad news. It added significant offensive power, but from this point onwards there wasn't really anywhere for me to put my skill points. The Warlock does have a few other passives, but those are only for boosting spells and summons. So for now, my skill build was, sadly, finished, before even making it through the first half of normal difficulty. Though with the new polearm and max levitation mastery, I was able to progress through the jungle fairly easily. Ormus gave me a rare ring with a lot of stats on it as a quest reward, but upon further inspection, it was one of the worst rings with 6 stats I have ever seen. Yet somehow, it turned out to be a major upgrade for me. As I went through the act, my chance to hit was increasingly becoming an issue, so before taking on the end of the act, I repeated the abandoned Kurast areas a few times for experience. And let me quickly expand on why my character level was so important. It was all about my chance to hit enemies. In Diablo 2, the chance for an attack to hit is dependent on the attacker's attack rating stat and the defender's defense stat, but the difference in monster level and character level plays a major role too, arguably too big of a role. In my experience, if you are at a similar level to your enemies, you can really make a difference by having a high attack rating stat. But once you start being underleveled, it becomes very difficult to hit enemies no matter what. So this character had to do a fair bit of experience farming on his quest through the game. In a perfect world, I should have made it so that I was slightly overleveled before moving on to new areas, but with only the basic attack. That was a hard sell, since grinding for experience was a grind, though attack rating was still very important, so when I found this rare circlet, I kind of hit a jackpot, almost 100 extra attack rating and a decent chunk of fire damage. But in a cruel twist of fate, it spawned ethereal, which meant that it could never be repaired. A great find, but the knowledge that it would not last made it feel wasteful to use, so for the time being I saved it in the stash for particularly tough fights. I also found a nice rare armor with cold and fire resistance, and it really was about time I started to worry about my resistances, as I was about to face Mephisto and then Act 4 after him, with an abundance of elemental damage. After leveling up to 25, I've moved on to the High Council of Travincal. The preparation paid off, as I was able to handle them well. 80% chance to hit wasn't great, but it wasn't terrible either, and when my attacks did land, they dealt serious damage. I could not really handle their damage though, so I definitely had to kite them backwards and separate them, but 2 or 3 of them at a time was manageable. After reaching the Durance of Fate level 3 and taking out Mephisto's entourage, I returned to town for some final preparations. I equipped the Ethereal Circlet, and I also put on Cleglav's gloves for the 25% slow, a really powerful stat against act bosses especially. I once again downed several potions for the temporary resistance boost, though there are no lightning potions, so Mephisto's lightning spells were going to hurt. And they did. In fact, most of Mephisto's spells hurt pretty badly despite my preparations. But he was not able to one-shot me, and compared to Duriel's relentless rushing, Mephisto was much easier to disengage from. Trading blows with the Lord of Hatred and then periodically healing up out of range, I steadily worked on his health bar. Towards the end of the fight, I hid behind a pillar and put my Magic Find gear back on, a calculated risk to maximize the rarity of his drops. And when I landed the final blow, he did drop several rares and even a set item, though unfortunately, they weren't any good. It felt as though my investment in Magic Find gear had paid off in quantity of rare loot, but not yet in quality. Act 4 can be quite tough for weak melee characters, especially the Venom Lords and the Undead Knights. One of the reasons that I farmed all the way to level 25 in Act 3 was so that I could run along the edge of the first few areas in Act 4 without falling too far behind. I even skipped the lucrative side quest to defeat Isuel, as I could not really make use of the 2 skill points from the quest. The effort to reward ratio of taking him down was a terrible proposition. Though even when skipping a lot of enemies, Act 4 was a struggle. My survivability was mediocre, my chance to hit was dropping low again, and several monster types had strong abilities, like these ogres stunning me and knocking me back with their attacks. My only saving grace was that my damage was still pretty good, and I only needed to land a few attacks per enemy. It was a grind, but it was not a roadblock. Though I did take the time to take down Hephasto and do the Hellforge quest. Hephasto was a grind on his own, but the rune and gem rewards had great potential. I got an Enrune from the Hellforge as well as a perfect Sapphire, which would end up being useful soon, despite not thinking too much of it at the time. I entered the Chaos Sanctuary, Diablo's stronghold, still fielding some of those dangerous melee monster types, now with the addition of Oblivion Knights, adding curses and ranged projectiles to an already unfavorable situation. I had no chance in a sustained encounter, I had to hit and run, slowly wearing every pack of monsters down and patiently inch my way forward. This playstyle is not uncommon during my challenge runs, but even regular enemies being this much of a struggle already was a bit worrying, but what kept me going was the knowledge that this was the hardest area I would encounter for a while, and that the next act would have good opportunities for me to grow more powerful. When I reached the center of the map, I went back to town to see if there was anything I could do gear-wise to help me out on the final stretch to Diablo. With a magic mold from a vendor, the perfect sapphire from the Hellforge, a jewel and a tier rune, I crafted a big chunky hammer. It didn't really outperform my old weapon at the top end, but higher average damage and the inherent bonus to undead meant that it was still an upgrade, even if a small one. I also put on the ethereal circlet again, which had been resting in my stash after Mephisto, praying that the durability would last until Diablo himself. And also Cleglov's gloves again to help against the Seal Guardians. And finally, I put a Ral rune and a flawed diamond into a random 2-socketed shield for some resistances. I lost a little bit of damage and 1 level of levitation mastery from my book this way, but a nice chunk of fire resist was going to be very useful for the rest of Act 4, basically scrambling for any stat boost I could get my hands on to make the rest of the Chaos Sanctuary a bit more tolerable. I was still not able to stand my ground and fight enemies head on, but the hit and run routine certainly felt both faster and safer with the new gear, like fixing the AC in your old rundown summer car. It's still a piece of junk, but at least you'll feel a little nicer while enjoying it. The closest call was against the Infector of Souls, who nearly cornered me as I summoned him. I barely managed to juke him and get out of the seal area, and once I was out in the open, I could kite him around and managed to snipe the leader, and as he was the final seal guardian, the rest of my enemies went up in flame. Next up was Diablo. With good fire resistance and a decent life pool, I could soak up most of his attacks. His lightning was devastating though, and it got me a couple of times early in the fight. But once I started to respect his damage, and the slowness of my own attack animation, I got into the groove of it and managed to dance around his spells. I had to pick my moments to go in and deal some damage, but even when a window presented itself, damage was not guaranteed with a mere 60% chance to hit. But my damage output was not the only thing that was slow. The slow applied to Diablo from my gloves was quite noticeable. I eventually worked through all of Diablo's health bar, and once again, the loot from the boss was trash. I was just happy to be done with the fight though. After the struggles in the Chaos Sanctuary, the start of Act 5 was a step back in difficulty, but it was clear to me that I had to prepare. With no AoE, I figured it was better for me to repeat farm some elite monsters instead of doing full area clears, so I started the 5th act by doing just that. During my leveling session I found a rare polearm, similar damage to my maul but with over 100 extra attack rating. It was a very welcome addition towards my chance to hit issues. And then with the runes from the quest reward for saving some captured barbarians, I made the rune word Ancient's Pledge, a solid upgrade to my resistance boosting shield. Powering up in Act 5 took me several hours, but it was necessary, and to be honest, apart from the tedium, it was going fine. But I made a terrible mistake. After the Diablo fight, I did not switch out my beautiful rare circlet, and in the frozen river on my way to save Anya, the circlet broke completely. This was inevitable, but I should really have saved it for more important fights, and the loss of the stats really hurt. But it turned out to only be a temporary setback. After rescuing Anya, the quest reward left 3 out of my 4 resistances capped. And with Anya safely back in town, I decided to gamp circlets from her and scored basically the same thing, about 100 attack rating and some fire damage. The minor stats were even better on this one too. Rest in peace, Eaglecrest, long live Bloodhorn. This is not financial advice, but gambling is often the solution to my Diablo 2 related problems. And after that I spent even more time farming levels. I am summarizing hours of grinding in a couple of sentences in this video. It was simply not that interesting, but it did take a lot of time. I eventually climbed up to the Ariat summit at level 33 to challenge the Ancients for their right to enter the Wellstone Keep. I didn't even bother trying to fight them all at once, and immediately ran around trying to separate them. With a tardy gate, no movement skills and no summons to distract them, that was easier said than done. But I eventually managed to lose one of them and then positioned myself so that the less gifted one threw his axes into a stone pillar to create a one-on-one battle with Corlic. The extra levels had really paid off and I sported a very unremarkable 80% chance to hit. And before long I took down 1 and then 2 of the Ancients. But the final one was the most dangerous. Talik's Whirlwind dealt by far the most damage of any of their attacks, and I was starting to run low on potions. But this hack of a magician had another trick up his sleeve. If you get Talik to stand at the very edge of the terrain, facing out towards the abyss, he is unable to use Whirlwind. I guess that you need solid ground to target for the attack to work. This looks a bit weird, but rest assured that there is tactical value to this position. After tricking Talik into a low-powered duel without fancy skills, something I was quite experienced in by now, I defeated the final barbarian before I ran out of potions. My character felt surprisingly decent after the last level grind, or maybe I had simply conditioned myself to appreciate the small wins. Don't get me wrong, this was by all measures a terrible character, but for what it was, a character not using any skills, it was doing alright. It was just that he didn't excel in any regard. He was sturdy, but not really tanky, especially not against physical damage. He was hitting his enemies more often than not, but not really consistently. His damage was decent, but limited to a single target at a time. Bale was actually not at all as annoying as he often is for my challenge runs. With good resistances, his cold wave wasn't too dangerous, and his mana burn spell didn't faze me at all. At long last, a situation where there was some advantage to not using skills. It took some time to wear down, but it was a pretty straightforward fight. I forgot to put my Cleglov's gloves on for this fight, and as a reminder, Bale dropped me another pair. With Bale defeated, I had beaten the first difficulty, and next up was Nightmare. Tougher enemies, more elites, and a hefty penalty to my resistances. At this point I was really questioning the decision to set hell as the goal for this character, somehow underestimating the absolute slog of playing through an ARPG without skills. But I had some big plans for the start of the second difficulty, an idea which had acted as the light at the end of the tunnel while enduring the grind through normal. I rushed through the first half of Act 1 to reach the Forgotten Tower as quickly as possible and embarked on another, you guessed it, grind session in the rune mines. I was determined to farm a few very specific runes, but calling these Countess runs is misleading. These were at best Countess walks, or perhaps even Countess crawls. I guess I could technically have skipped more enemies on my way down the cellar, but I figured I might as well grab some experience while I was putting myself through this anyway. Even defeating the Countess was a chore at the start, having to rely on doorways to funnel her bodyguards a few at a time. But she was possible, and that was all I needed to dig into this grind. Some drops were disappointing, some were whatever the opposite of disappointing is, but the runes were steadily stacking up. And not only runes, I found a very nice Grand Charm too, with almost 100 extra attack rating for the low cost of 3 inventory spaces. I also found a unique belt. Night Smoke has 10 to all resistances. Not amazing, but perfectly decent. After about 3 hours I finally found a Hell rune, one of the runes I was looking for. But that was not enough. I was looking for a different one too, so I kept at it. Another couple of hours later, still no luck. But the beauty of running the Countess for runes is that even if you don't get what you're looking for, you're getting something. And with enough drops I was able to cube up to the other rune I required, Shale. And now this character was ready to evolve to his next form, with the use of the new Warlock rune word, Authority. This has +2 skills, resistances, and even some added damage, which are all great, but this armor was mainly about one stat and one stat only, a 10% chance to cost a level 15 Miasma Chain on striking. This skill latches onto enemies and deals magic damage to all enemies it touches. I was still using the basic attack, it was my armor casting the spells, so it was completely within the rules for the challenge. Don't question it, what little was left of my sanity hinged on this loophole. This skill is pretty good, but it's also a bit janky. It felt quite inconsistent in how it dealt damage, but having access to some form of AoE, any form of AoE, no matter how janky or inconsistent, felt like the world's biggest upgrade for this character. The armor also has a 2% chance to cast a defensive shield spell when the Warlock gets hit, which absorbs some damage and can stun melee attackers, which was really nice, but at a 2% chance it was extremely unreliable. But wait, there's more. Relying on a skill cast by an item often very quickly falls off. You cannot increase the level of skills triggered from items by +2 skill scare, but you can actually synergize them. So even though I did not technically cast the Miasma Chain, by dumping all of my otherwise useless skill points into Miasma Chain's synergies, I could beef up the spell proc even further. And this was the real hidden power to my plan. Actually, this was my entire plan for this character to have any chance at all to make it through the harder difficulties. My basic Warlock now had a very strong AoE spell in his arsenal, capable of mowing down big groups of weaker enemies quickly. At least 10% of the time anyway. Actually, less than that, since the 10% chance to trigger the spell only applies to attacks that hit, so sometimes I had to wait for quite a while before it went off. Fights had now taken a completely different form. They started out looking the same as before, being surrounded by enemies, trying to get attacks in to slowly wear them down. But then when Miasma Chain triggered, I stopped fighting and ran around my enemies instead, taking them down several times quicker than I could have done with just the basic attack. And I got to feel like an actual hero for a few seconds whenever that happened, and that felt great. With newfound power, I moved on to Andariel quickly, and the chains proved capable of taking down Act bosses as well. Not that she fell to a single chain or anything like normal monsters, but compared to the basic attack, it was crushing even Act bosses. For now anyway. As I moved on through the desert, the damage from my basic attack became less and less relevant. It was now merely a vessel to summon my lord and savior, Miasma Chain. And the loot gods must have been entertained by my new playstyle, because they blessed me with a very unique sword, the Skewer of Krinitz. By all accounts a very mediocre weapon, which damage-wise had no place this late into the game. But one line of text is very rare to find on items, and was perfect for this exact situation. Ignores target's defense. This does exactly what it says, and basically solved all of my attack rating issues, with one very important exception. It does not work against elite enemies at all. So it wasn't really overpowered as much as it was simply very convenient, and when fighting normal monsters, I experienced consistency that this character had only dreamt of before. As a melee fighter who had been struggling to hit his enemies reliably throughout most of the game, and had spent a lot of time in slow attack animations and getting them interrupted, having a fast, consistent attack felt so smooth compared to my old days of 70% chance to hit with mauls and polearms. It was a bit of a temporary crutch, since the item itself is absolute trash apart from the ignores target defense, but for the time being I thoroughly enjoyed it. In fact, I enjoyed it so much that I decided to invest some resources and upgrade it in the cube for a bit more damage. In the grand scheme of things, this was probably not worth the runes, but this was less about min-maxing and more about paying respect to a fun item which fit the run very well. Though as it did not work at all against elite enemies, such as giant maggots and other act bosses, against Duriel my chance to hit dropped below 60%. This was a messy fight, but I stood up to his assault fairly well, while Duriel didn't stand up to my chains nearly as well, though it took nearly 10 minutes, including 2 trips to town, before I triggered enough chains to defeat him. Duriel dropped another unique sword, but Plaguebearer was not what I was looking for with this character. I also found a pretty cool maul, which I at first intended to upgrade and use as an elite killer, but that never came to be. Because early on in the jungle I found a partisan with 4 open sockets, and by putting the runes Rel, Tyr, Tal and Sol into this, I made the Insight rune word. Often used as a mercenary stick by spellcasters for the free meditation aura to help out with mana regen. But this is also an extremely potent melee weapon in its own right, with enhanced damage, a huge bonus to attack rating and a slew of other solid stats. This was exactly what I was looking for to make the actual damage of my melee attacks relevant again. Though I failed to account for the Skewer of Krinitz giving me plus 10 to strength. But one more level and an old book returned to Alcor's library later, I scraped together enough stats, and look at that, 500 to 1000 damage. By giving my enemies their defense back, I did not hit them as often, so I was not triggering Miasma Chain as consistently. But on the other hand, this weapon actually did something even when the chains didn't trigger, so it added consistent damage output in another way. I did not expect to be using the Skewer of Krinitz for less than 2 acts, but this polearm was certainly a lot more powerful. With my offense having been improved significantly, I once again turned to gambling to try and improve my defensive stats as well. I gambled belts and got this one with 51 life, some fire and lightning resistance and 24% faster hit recovery. I lost some resistances in total from Night Smoke, but having some FHR as well as more potion slots was nice. Then I gambled gloves and got a rare pair with attack speed. The slow from clay gloves was very good in fights where I struggled, so I kept them around, but attacking faster seemed like a great deal when doing this much damage. Then I gambled most of my remaining gold on boots and amulets, but I didn't get anything good. I add that for some nuance. I don't want to be accused of being a shill for Geed and Big Gamble. In Travancore, I was crippled by cold damage. Being slowed was annoying, but it also kind of ruined my entire angle of attack, as this slow of an attack animation made it much more likely that enemies would interrupt my attacks or simply run away before my attack landed. Getting a way to mitigate that moved up to the top of my list of priorities. And here's a very lucky and also very unfortunate item drop. I found a unique serpent skin armor from the council. The skin of the Viper Magi is a great armor, and I got a perfect 35 roll on the resist all, but there was simply no way that this character could ever give up on the authority armor. It is a dark day in Sanctuary when a plus 35 Viper Magi is banished to the dusty realms of the shared stash. But going back to my issues with cold damage slowing me down, as Mephisto is a multifaceted mage, proficient in several elements, including cold magic, I decided to farm the runes for Rhyme before taking him on. Hello Countess, my old friend. I found some boot upgrades while doing this. Tear Haunch with movement speed, 10 to all resistances and some stats, as well as another Steel Grand Charm with 102 attack rating, which translated to over 500 total after all of my percentage based bonuses. Very nice. The rune that I was looking for once again eluded me, even though I got some other nice runes. I ended up cubing the shale again and made the Rhyme in a bone shield. The main thing was the cannot be frozen stat, making me immune to being slowed by cold damage, but also some decent resist all, a block boost and a bit of magic find. A very solid shield, and this character's gear loadout was really starting to come together nicely now. I was not really planning on going for a block heavy build, but with this shield and already having a decent investment in dexterity, I was by accident sporting a decent block chance at over 50%. Mephisto dished out some heavy damage, but between solid resistances and 700 life, I endured. The fact that Levitation Mastery reduced the stat requirements of my weapon was becoming more powerful the further I went. At my current level, it reduced the requirements by almost half, and now using a mid-tier polearm, that translated to a significant amount of stat points saved that could be invested in vitality instead. And I can also not overstate how great it was that the Warlock can use a two-hander plus a shield at the same time. In a lot of my challenge runs, I have to choose between decent damage from a big weapon or the safety of a shield, but this time I could have both. In contrast to when I ran past the start of Act 4 in normal, in Nightmare I did take my time to seek out Isual, as now I very much benefited from additional skill points to synergize my purple chains, and fighting a few enemies at a time wasn't too problematic. I got a Fall rune from the Hellforge, a pretty high rune as far as Nightmare Hellforge goes. I did not have an immediate use for it, but it would end up being put to good use later. I kept going towards Diablo, and as it often happens in my challenge runs, the key was patience. Fighting like this had become second nature to me now at this point. To take out groups of enemies I simply had to get a spell proc, and with no control over if it would be on the first hit or the 20th, I surrendered myself to RNG and focused my efforts on not getting frustrated and impatient, because getting greedy with trying to force a proc to go off could quickly put me into horrible situations. I found another solid rune in the Chaos Sanctuary, an rune. Unfortunately, most of the rune words using an rune also require some other very rare runes, but the is a very solid socket filler on its own. It took me a little over 20 minutes from entering the Chaos Sanctuary to defeating the final Seal Guardian and summon Diablo. It wasn't fast, but it had been mostly smooth sailing, and that resulted in me letting my guard down, trying to get a cool clip for the video, showing off my chance to hit Diablo in the middle of fighting. I played with my character screen open and didn't pay enough attention to my life pool, and he got me. That was embarrassing, and it wasn't even his infamous lightning beam that got me. This death humbled me again and acted as a reminder that attention is a scarce resource. A lot of the fight ended up with me running around at a half screen's length, trying to dodge his damage, so despite my damage being better than ever before, it took me nearly 5 minutes to wear him down. He dropped several rares, though nothing really noteworthy. The boots were pretty alright I guess, but I preferred my unique ones. The majority of Act 5 of Nightmare was uneventful as far as challenging obstacles go, though I did find a pair of goblin toes, and this was a funny drop, because in my last video I said this. This is the kind of item I am always secretly hoping for when I do my runs with barbarians or paladins, but one that I don't think I have ever found on a challenge run before, and then on the next run I found it on a melee character. 25 Crushing Blow is amazing for dealing with tanky enemies, but that's all these boots do. And relying so heavily on hit and run tactics, I felt that I needed boots with movement speed for mobility. They were certainly worth saving in the stash though for specific encounters. In the Frozen River I encountered my very first completely physical immune enemy. This could have been an absolute rank killer, but Miasma Chain deals magic damage, so it was not only my only source of AoE, it was also my solution to physical immunes, as if I wasn't relying on it heavily enough already. With hell looming on the horizon, I once again paused before the Ancients and spent some extra time in the easier parts of the act, grinding for levels. There was no doubt in my mind that I had to be significantly higher level before hell, so I figured I might as well get those levels in before taking on the barbarians and then the Worldstone Keep. I did this until I hit level 59. I would have liked to push into the 60s, but with how slow and inefficient it was, I could only handle so much of it at a time. My preparation for Hell over-prepared me for the Nightmare Ancients. With good damage, 50% chance to block, and a big life pool supported by lots of potions, I took care of them with little effort. And then the Throne Room waves played out similarly. In these isolated, predictable battles with no other chaff flanking me from behind as I kited them around, I was not having much trouble at all. I'm using this word a bit generously here, but I even crushed Lister, and that was a big surprise to me. And then Bale followed the same pattern too, so what was going on here? Why was I struggling against random trash, but all of a sudden having an easy time against the final boss and his guardians? I was quite a strong fighter against one or just a few enemies, with the slow from Cleglav's gloves and the crushing blow from Goblin Toes, which I swapped in for these encounters. I will illustrate the problem of fighting random groups of enemies, but first, loot. I found Jalal's Mane, an extremely strong item for shapeshifter druids, with the only downside being that it can only be worn by druids. And also a Dusk Deep, a pretty solid defensive helm, but not really what I'd be wanting to wear into Hell if I could help it. After defeating Bale, I started a new Nightmare game and went back to the Worldstone Keep and found a large group of enemies to illustrate my point. I was quite sturdy, no doubt about it, but Diablo 2 simply isn't the type of game where you stand in the middle of an ocean of monsters and just tank it all. Most characters handle big groups of enemies either by having high damage AoE to kill them quickly, or they have summons or crowd control magic to help them reduce incoming damage. I did have very good AoE in Miasma Chain from my armor, but that was of course unreliable at best, and for this particular fight I could just kite around until it procced. But in some fights, especially against fast or ranged enemies, getting the chains to proc before I got completely overrun had proved to be tricky. I stuck around in Nightmare for a while to get a few more levels before Hell, and when repeating Bale, I found a very interesting crossbow. Doomslinger, a repeating crossbow with very fast attacks and 35% chance to pierce enemies. The damage was bad, awful, terrible, but perhaps this could be a way to safely trigger the chains against tough crowds. I tried it out and preliminary testing looked promising. The fast attack speed was somewhat negated by the low attack rating of the bow, but attacking from a distance with decent move speed was very safe, something I would surely benefit from as I went up against the many tough melee monsters in Hell. I stayed in Nightmare until I hit level 65, and I really enjoyed this playstyle of using the crossbow to thin out groups and then switching to the inside to finish off the last few remaining enemies. I liked it so much that I decided to commit to it and socketed the bow at Larsuk and put an Ethrune into it for minus 25% enemy defense before I moved on to Hell. Starting out in Hell, the crossbow worked out really well, and that was good, because fighting in melee proved to be even worse than I had anticipated. I must admit that the level 15 Miasma Chain from the armor was overperforming my expectations in terms of damage. Maxing out its synergies increased the damage with several 100%, so it was still doing very solid damage. So, somehow, I was going through the first act of Hell pretty smoothly, grinding my way through one chain trigger at a time. Fast enemies, like Treehead Woodfist, were tricky though, so I swapped out my gloves and decided to use Clay gloves all the time. They might only have 2 stats, but for a ranged attacker especially, they were very good ones. The knockback plus slow when kiting with a crossbow was just amazing. Somewhere around this point I also decided to shop for a Visionary's Magic Helm for a percentage-based bonus to attack rating to help with hitting more with my bow switch. In hindsight, I'm a bit torn on this, since if you trade too much of your flat attack rating for percentage-based bonuses, you might end up worse off, and the circlet had some nice extra stats on top. But it wasn't a major change. The look of my character was probably the biggest impact that this item had. I did not want to spend another day in the rune mines, but I did go to visit the Countess once for the quest. That didn't net me any particularly good runes, but I found a scythe with sockets, and this will be important later. Then I crafted a blood amulet. Not great stat, but 10% movement speed fit very well with my new archer identity. Against Andariel I switched back to my melee weapon, and I also brought my Goblin Toes to the fight for the crushing blow, and that was rather effective. I still had to run away from her every now and then to avoid death, but this was not too bad of a fight at all considering I was in the final difficulty. Upon her demise she dropped a unique Espandon, Crainty Vomir, and this was another very interesting drop, since now I almost exclusively used my bow to deal with most enemies, and only brought out the melee switch to finish off the 1 to 2 remaining enemies of a pack, or as a way to apply crushing blow from my boots against act bosses. So perhaps this sword was a better weapon than my Insight Partisan. Very fast attack speed, some movement speed for maneuverability, some physical damage reduction, and an additional 35% slow target, which when paired with the slow from my gloves would help tremendously against big nasty enemies, like the upcoming Duriel fight. This item spoke to me deeply and I welcomed it as my new melee weapon switch, uncertain if it was actually better than Insight or not, but the rule of cool tipped the scales in its favor. A very unique sword. Trying out the new sword in the desert, the damage per hit was noticeably lower, but the drop in overall DPS wasn't that bad thanks to the much faster swings, and the slow, that alone made this weapon super useful. Just look at the difference between these two beetles moving around. In the Tombs of the Act, I started encountering magic immune mummies that were unscathed by miasma chain. I certainly had the ability to wear down the odd magic immune enemy, but the issue with mummies in particular was that they kept resurrecting skeletons around them, so I could never keep it to an isolated fight. Simply put, a pain in my ass. I found Act 2 of Hell to be a bit dry. It took quite a while to grind through, but it was not that interesting. The toughest part was grabbing the Claw Viper amulet from Fangskin, since the area is small and Fangskin and his snakes can rush you down fast, and there was nowhere for me to retreat to. I died once, which meant that I had to reset the map and do the whole temple over again. But then I cheesed this pack with pot shots from off screen, and then ran in to grab the amulet and get out of there as quickly as possible. Towards the end of the act, I was getting hungry for gear upgrades again, but it was increasingly harder for me to upgrade my gear. I decided to double down on my unique sword, and socketed it with my last available socketing quest, and put the Amrune from earlier into it for 25% chance of open wounds, giving my melee switch some extra damage and more importantly, a way to stop monster regen for several seconds, a big help in dealing with the mummies in Tal Rasha's tomb. I once again challenged the King of Worms, and the slow from my gear immediately proved to be just as unfair as I had hoped, reducing the fight from a 1 vs 1 to a 1 vs a half. Between Crushing Blow, open wounds and a massive slow target, I was very prepared for this fight, though it was made harder by the fact that the Cannot Be Frozen stat on my Rhyme Shield did not stop the slowing effect from Duriel's Holy Freeze aura. And even in this crippled state, Duriel could dish out some mean damage if he got a few hits in a row. Though being so slowed down, I had no trouble disengaging from him whenever I needed a break to let my potions heal me up, and under these unfair conditions I was able to defeat him. Act 3 was fine. Lots of enemies, but they were kind of weak, so Miasma Chain worked really well, and lots of enemies meant lots of chances to trigger the spell. I started dying every now and then, which for a challenge like this wouldn't have been too big of a deal at all for me personally. But this, losing experience whenever I died, was in a way more painful than usual since every additional level helped my chance to hit. With a hell resistance penalty, elemental damage was really dangerous towards the second half of the difficulty, Mephisto included. But by encroaching on Mephisto's personal space, he used his melee and poison attacks more often than his more dangerous cold and lightning spells. This worked out really well in my favor, but I had been grinding through all of Act 3 in one very long session, so as soon as I saw the fight going well, I mentally checked out and claimed the victory in advance, which of course made me drop my guard and not pay enough attention, and seemingly out of nowhere. I say seemingly, but of course it is obvious where it came from. Mephisto killed me. Well, at least I had not been so careless that I didn't leave a safety portal so I could make it back to the fight safely, and while letting my left index finger rest on my potion hotkey, I managed to grind Mephisto down. Act 4 was also fine, because I ran past half of it. I skipped Isual again, because now I had mostly maxed out Miasma Chain synergies, at least the damage boosting ones. I have already glazed Kleglav's pincers several times, but I can't overstate how nice the slow and knockback was in narrow terrain like the River of Flame. I am not sure if I would have had enough room to kite backwards if it wasn't for these gloves. This playthrough definitely put this item on my list of low-level pet items. Then I got one-shot by Hephasto the Armorer while at full life with a life pool of over 1000. What? Excuse me? Okay, he was extra strong and he had the Fanaticism aura, but come on, one hit taking out 1000 life. This is why I don't play hardcore, by the way. And also, I was extremely happy to have ended up with a ranged weapon for situations exactly like this. The Hellforge gave me a co-rune, and now it's time to summon those loot drops that I pinned from earlier. This co-rune, the Fel rune from the Nightmare Hellforge, and then Heal, Thal and F, of which I had plenty. Those are the runes for obedience, an extremely strong melee rune word. I would actually argue that it's one of the best rune words in the game if you consider the rarity of the runes required at all. An absolutely massive damage boost. big crushing blow, and a chance to cast level 21 enchant when you kill an enemy, which adds like another 100 fire damage and 200% attack rating. An extremely well-rounded and powerful weapon. But the only eligible weapon that I had found was that 5-socketed scythe from the tower, and that's just a trash item base. I could have made an absolutely killer weapon for this character if I had gone and farmed a better base item with 5 sockets, but as I was kind of close to the end, and having already used both of my available Larsa quests already, I ended up making obedience in the scythe instead. What a sad looking obedience. But it was still quite useful as a pre-buff weapon, which is why I made it at all. By going back to Act 1 and slashing Fallen until enchant triggered, I got a very nice chunk of extra attack rating, and the high level enchant lasted for about 10 minutes, which, while not that long considering how slowly this character grinded through areas, was absolutely worth the effort of TPing out to refresh the buff periodically. Clearing out the Chaos Sanctuary was going well, the terrain played right into my crossbow wielding hands. There was one big setback though, but it was completely my own mistake. With the introduction of Reign of the Warlock, the buttons on the pause screen have changed to make room for an in-game drill tracker and a loot filter, changing a menu which has been looking the same for many years. After taking a brief break and returning to the post game, I hit save and exit instead of resume game, and lost about half an hour of Chaos Sanctuary progress. Let's call it a tactical reset to ensure that I got enough experience to level up before Diablo. The Lord of Terror started the fight by trapping me in a bone prison. This would have been an absolute death sentence, but I have learned that if you TP out of the prison and then come back, the game actually puts you outside of the prison. Other than that, the tension of this fight was not that high. The slow really made act bosses a lot easier. Though I want to mention something for Diablo specifically, it seems like they have finally fixed the bug where he would completely miss you with his lightning attack in Nightmare and Hell if you stood close enough to him, which means no more cheesing him with melee characters in challenge runs. This fix is really bad news for my characters in general, but this time it worked out swimmingly thanks to the crippling slow. Act 5 Hell, the final act of the final difficulty. I had reached my final form at this point. Miasma Chain was fully synergized and held up really well damage-wise. My gear, while not amazing, was working very well together for what I was trying to do with this character, and it was getting harder to upgrade any piece of it as they were all mostly decent items and several of them had very unique and rare stats like the slowest target on hit. And while more levels would have helped out a lot still, I was now approaching the point of extra levels requiring so much grinding that it didn't feel worth it, so I strapped in for one final slow cooking push towards the end. This run was fun but frustrating. It ended up being a lot more powerful and more fun to play than I could have imagined when setting up the rules. I was planning on using the Miasma Chains from Authority from the very start, but I did not expect them to stay this strong throughout Hell. What I enjoyed the most of all though was making great use out of the items I found along the way. Having items like Cleglav's pincers, Crane Tivamir and then the Doomslinger crossbow warp the run as much as they did made the playthrough feel both very unique and rewarding. But relying so heavily on something so unreliable as the 10% chance to trigger the Miasma Chains on a successful hit made for very high variance in gameplay. And while having some amount of randomness to battles to spice it up can be fun, the extreme nature of this particular RNG caused a lot of frustration. And it was not only about triggering the spell, it was also about my survivability. With a ranged attack, good move speed and good defensive stats on my sword and shield swap, I had the tools for handling a lot of tough situations, but the margin of error was so slim. In the fight against the Ancients, I got body blocked by one of them while kiting them in circles with the crossbow out, and that led me to get instantly destroyed by a whirlwind attack about halfway through the fight. But then when the kiting tactic worked as intended, the fight was very easy. Well, several minutes and 380 arrows for a single fight might not sound like a decisive victory, but trust me, it felt like one. I had to pull out all my tactics one final time against the throne room waves, shooting them from off-screen, pulling them apart and kiting them all the way back to the entrance and abusing the stats of my items. But this far into the run, in my eyes, this was simply how the game of Diablo 2 was played. And then finally Bale. There is not much to say about this fight. If you stack enough slowest target, Bale completely breaks. It's something about his animations becoming so long that the attacks end up cancelling themselves. Sometimes the effects of an attack even came out, but they didn't do any damage. Bale was a sitting duck, and I slowly whittled away at him with crushing blow and open wounds, a heroic ending to what can otherwise only be described as a Pyrrhic victory over the challenge. So there you go, Diablo 2 beaten only using the basic attack, with some very heavy lifting from my gear. Thanks again to boot.dev for sponsoring this video. If you wanna check it out, there's links in the description and the pinned comment. Thanks for watching, and thanks to all the lovely goblins who pledged their support to my shenanigans on YouTube and Twitch.